Have you ever looked at someone and made a silent judgment, just because of the way they looked, or the car they drove, or how they didn't say a word? Maybe it happened in a parking lot, at a gas station, or when a stranger passed you on the sidewalk. We all do it, even when we don't mean to. But sometimes, the story behind those quiet eyes is nothing like we imagined. It was just after dawn when he pulled into the gas station, an older man, silver hair cropped short, shoulders slightly hunched, wearing a worn military jacket that had seen better years. His SUV was coated in dried mud, its black paint faded from time and weather. From the outside, it looked like a vehicle on its last legs. From the inside, it was his home. He moved slowly, carefully, like someone whose body carried stories in every joint. No hurry. No expression. Just a quiet man in a quiet town, hoping for nothing more than a tank of gas and maybe a few more miles before the sun got too high. Inside the store, a young manager watched him through the window. Suspicious. Uneasy. Already on the phone before the man had even reached the pump. Maybe it was the way he walked. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, calm, unreadable. Or maybe it was just the way small towns treat unfamiliar faces. By the time the pump clicked off, 2 police cruisers had pulled in. One blocked the exit. The other parked sideways, lights flashing though no siren sounded. Officers stepped out, hands hovering near their holsters. "Sir, we need you to stop right there," one of them called out. The man stopped. Turned slowly. Raised his hands slightly, enough to show he wasn't a threat. No anger. No fear. Just silence. The store manager came rushing out, pointing. "That's him. That's the guy. He stole it." The officers moved in. They asked for ID. He didn't have any. Asked if the vehicle was his. He said nothing. Not a word. Just a faint blink, as if the weight of the question had already been answered long ago. They cuffed him right there next to pump number 4. No resistance. No defense. And when the glove compartment popped open during the routine search, a sealed envelope slid into view. On the front, in neat handwriting, was a name, Daniel McAllister. And just like that, the story began to change. Inside the station, the young manager stood behind the counter, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He watched through the window as the officers spoke with the older man, still calm, still silent. The manager's eyes narrowed, jaw clenched, already convinced he was right. One of the officers walked back inside. "We're gonna bring him in," he said flatly. "Won't give us a name, no ID, no registration." The manager nodded quickly, as if he'd just confirmed a suspicion he'd been carrying all morning. "Yeah, I told you." He was circling the pumps. Looked shady. Probably scoping the place out. Back outside, the second officer guided Dan toward the squad car. His hands were cuffed behind him now, but he didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He just moved the way a man moves when he knows there's no convincing anyone of anything anymore. A few early risers had gathered across the parking lot, standing behind a row of parked cars. 2 men in ball caps, a woman with a coffee in hand. One of them muttered, "Must have been living in that thing. Probably stole it a week ago." Dan heard it, but he didn't flinch. He'd grown used to the voices. Used to the way people stared and turned away, sometimes in the same breath. Used to the way quiet men were treated like threats. At the Millfield Police Department, they led him into a dimly lit hallway that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The place was quiet, no shouting, no chaos. Just routine. Just another day. They sat him down in a small room with a metal table bolted to the floor. The chair creaked beneath his weight. One of the officers uncuffed him and left the room without a word. Dan sat still. Hands flat on the table. Eyes low. Breathing even. The door opened again. Detective Eric Lawson stepped in, carrying a manila folder and a cup of coffee. He looked to be in his mid-40s, stocky build, clean-shaven, the kind of man who had once played high school football and still carried himself like a coach. He set the folder down and slid the coffee across the table. "Thought you might want something warm," he said. Dan didn't reach for it. Lawson waited a beat, then took a seat opposite him. "Let's start simple," he said, flipping the folder open. "Name?" Dan said nothing. Lawson studied him for a moment. "You're not making this easy," he continued. "You got a vehicle that was reported stolen out of Pittsburgh. No registration. No ID on you. And you're living in the car. You see how that looks to us, right?" Still, Dan didn't speak. Lawson sighed, leaned back in his chair. "Look, we're not here to give you a hard time. But you've got to give us something. Right now, this looks bad. Real bad." He tapped a photo clip to the folder. "This SUV belongs to a guy named Kyle Easton. Reported deceased 6 months ago. Cancer. Family says the car went missing about 3 weeks back." Dan's jaw shifted slightly, but he said nothing. Lawson leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Here's what I think," he said. "I think you saw the car. Saw an opportunity. Maybe you didn't mean any harm, maybe you were just looking for shelter. But this is still grand theft auto. You understand that?" Dan finally looked up. His eyes were pale blue, steady, unblinking, unreadable. Lawson blinked first. There was a pause, a long one. Then Lawson reached into the folder and pulled out a clear evidence bag. Inside was the envelope, still sealed, still untouched. This was in the glove compartment. "Got your name on it. Daniel McAllister." Dan stared at it. No reaction. No reach. Just stillness. "We haven't opened it yet," Lawson said. "We're waiting on a warrant. But if there's something in here that clears this up, you could make it a lot easier by just telling us." Dan returned his gaze to the table. Lawson shook his head and leaned back again. "Suit yourself," he said quietly. "But you're not helping your case." Outside the interview room, the officer who had brought him in stood leaning against the wall, arms crossed. "You asked me," he said to a passing sergeant. "Guy's probably been living in that truck for months. Looks like he's been out there a while." The sergeant nodded. "Yeah," he muttered. "Another ghost with no story anyone wants to hear." And inside that small room, Dan McAllister stayed silent. Not because he didn't have a story, but because he knew no one had ever really listened. Judge Harold Bennett sat alone at his desk in the quiet of his chambers, flipping through the next day's arraignment files with the same efficiency he had maintained for over 2 decades. The room smelled faintly of leather and old wood, the comforting scent of routine. He sipped lukewarm coffee, letting his eyes pass over petty thefts, minor assaults, and the usual stack of low-stakes cases. Then he saw it. One line. One name. Defendant, Daniel McAllister. Male. Approximate age, 63. Charge, grand theft auto. His hand stopped mid-turn. The file slipped slightly from his fingers and landed flat on the desk. He stared at the name. His eyes narrowed, lips pressing into a line. The coffee mug hovered just inches from his mouth, forgotten. Across the room, his clerk glanced up. "Judge? Everything okay?" Bennett didn't answer right away. He placed the mug down slowly and picked up the file again, this time reading the details more carefully. Homeless male. No ID. Arrested in possession of a vehicle reported stolen from a deceased military officer. Suspect refused to speak. "Where is this suspect now?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. The clerk paused, unsure. Holding. Picked up this morning. I believe Detective Lawson's handling it. Cancel my afternoon. Sir, you have the Henderson sentencing at 2. Reschedule it. The clerk hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Your Honor. 15 minutes later, Judge Bennett's black sedan pulled into the small parking lot of the Millfield Police Department. He rarely made unscheduled visits. Judges didn't go to police stations unless something serious was involved. His presence immediately caused heads to turn. The desk sergeant stood up straighter when he saw him. "Judge Bennett. Good afternoon. Didn't expect to see you here. I'm here about a suspect in custody. Daniel McAllister." The sergeant glanced down at his sheet, then motioned toward a hallway. "Detective Lawson has the case. I can get him for you." Moments later, Lawson emerged, clearly surprised. "Your Honor. I wasn't expecting. Is there an issue with the warrant? I want to see the vehicle." Lawson blinked. "The SUV? It's an impound. I know where it is." Lawson hesitated. "Yes, sir. This way." They walked in silence down the narrow corridor that led to the back lot. The judge's pace was deliberate, his expression unreadable. Outside, under a flat gray sky, the SUV sat where it had been parked hours earlier. Mud-streaked. Weathered. Unremarkable. Until you knew what to look for. Judge Bennett moved around the vehicle slowly, his eyes scanning every surface. He paused at the rear window. Faint, nearly erased by grime, was a Special Forces decal. Barely visible, but unmistakable to someone who recognized it. "Open the trunk," he said. The officer with the keys stepped forward, clicked it open. The trunk creaked as it rose. Inside, the layout was precise, everything had a place. A sleeping bag, carefully rolled. Water bottles lined up in a holder. A thermal blanket folded with military tightness. Bennett leaned in, his eyes scanning the side panels. Then he pointed. "There," he said. There was a compartment, almost invisible, built into the sidewall. The officer moved to open it. "Step back," Bennett said, firmly. "All of you." The officer froze. "I know what this is." And for the first time that day, the tone in Judge Bennett's voice made it clear. This was no ordinary case. And Daniel McAllister was no ordinary man. The impound lot was quiet except for the low hum of distant traffic and the occasional creak of rusted chain-link fencing swaying in the wind. The SUV stood alone beneath a canopy of gray clouds, its mud-caked surface dull and forgotten, like the man who'd been dragged from behind its wheel just hours before. Judge Bennett walked with careful, measured steps, his eyes still locked on the hidden compartment he had pointed out moments earlier. Behind him, Detective Lawson and two officers watched, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. The air around them had changed. The judge's presence shifted everything. A young evidence technician approached with a crowbar. "Should I open it, sir?" "No," Bennett replied without turning. "You'll damage it." He crouched down slowly, resting one knee on the pavement, and studied the panel's seam. With a gentle press of his thumb, there was a soft click. The panel gave way, revealing a slim, black case tucked carefully into the wall, military issue, waterproof, scratched around the edges but sealed tight. He didn't touch it right away. Lawson stepped forward, hesitant. "Judge, I'd like to remind you, this is an active investigation." "That's technically evidence." "I'm aware," Bennett said quietly, standing again. "But I also know what I'm looking at." He nodded to the technician. "Bring gloves." With gloved hands, the technician removed the case and placed it on a nearby table under the canopy. The group gathered close as Bennett unlocked the latches. Inside the case was a tightly organized collection of documents. Each folder was labeled. Neat handwriting. Military reports. Medical evaluations. A worn photo tucked between two manila files. Bennett reached for it slowly. The photo showed 7 men standing shoulder to shoulder in desert gear. Dust on their boots, mountains behind them. Faces serious. Young. All except one, Daniel McAllister. Even in the photo, he stood a little straighter. Not with pride, but with responsibility. Bennett stared at it for a moment longer than necessary. Then his eyes dropped to a thick envelope tucked beneath the folders. It wasn't sealed. Just closed carefully. On the front, a familiar name written in firm, confident print. To Judge Harold Bennett. The silence deepened. He picked it up with deliberate care, held it like something fragile. His voice was calm, but laced with something heavier. "Get McAllister," he said. Lawson blinked. "Right now?" "Yes," Bennett replied, still staring at the envelope. "Now." Minutes later, Dan was escorted into the impound lot. Still cuffed, still silent. The officers positioned him a few feet from the group. His eyes scanned the scene slowly, then settled on the judge. No fear. No surprise. Just quiet recognition. Bennett met his gaze. "You remember me?" Dan didn't answer. Bennett held up the envelope. This was in the trunk. Dan's eyes dropped to the paper. A flicker, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He nodded once. "I thought so," Bennett said softly. Then he turned to Lawson. "Take off the cuffs." Lawson hesitated. "Judge, he's still." "Take them off." The officers stepped forward, removed the restraints. Dan rubbed his wrists but said nothing. Bennett gestured to the open case. "Is this yours?" Dan looked down at the photo, the folders, the military markings. "Yes," he said, voice rough and unused. "Then we're going to take a look together." Bennett placed the envelope back inside the case, then closed it carefully, not yet ready to read it. He glanced at Dan again. "For now," he said, "we're going to do this right." And for the first time since his arrest, Daniel McAllister stood with the quiet weight of his story beginning to shift, just slightly, from silence toward recognition. Dan stood beside the table, his shoulders square, hands loose at his sides. The wind tugged softly at the hem of his jacket. Judge Bennett opened the case again, now slower, more reverently. He removed the envelope addressed to him and handed it off to a clerk nearby without reading it yet. His focus shifted to the other items inside. There was a second envelope, thicker, sealed, and labeled in familiar handwriting, to Daniel McAllister. Bennett turned to Dan. "Do you know what's in this?" Dan nodded once. "It's from Kyle." Lawson watched from the side, uneasy but silent. The other officers remained nearby, their posture tense but quiet. "Do I have your permission to open it?" the judge asked. Dan hesitated for a moment, then said, "He meant it for when I couldn't speak for myself." Bennett gave a slight nod of understanding. He opened the envelope gently, as if the paper itself could tear the moment. Inside, there were several documents, folded neatly. He pulled out a handwritten letter first. The writing was steady, deliberate. He cleared his throat before he read. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone," the letter began. "This vehicle and all of its contents belong to Master Sergeant Daniel McAllister. He's not just a friend, he's the man who carried me 3 miles through enemy fire when everyone else thought I wouldn't make it. He refused evacuation. He refused to leave me behind." The words hung in the air, drifting past the hum of engines and the wind rattling the nearby fence. He never asked for a medal. He never told the story. But if someone questions him, this is the truth. Bennett's voice slowed slightly. "He saved my life. And this truck was my last way of paying that back." He folded the letter and looked up. His voice was steady, but softer now. "There's more," he said, turning back to the case. He reached into the lower compartment and pulled out a wooden box. It was handcrafted, worn smooth from time and travel, with symbols carved into the lid, military insignia, coordinates, initials no one had touched but 2 men who had shared them. Dan looked down at it without blinking. "It's locked," he said. "You have the key." Dan reached under his shirt, pulled out a chain with a small brass key, and held it out. Bennett stepped aside, letting him do it himself. Dan knelt, pressed the key into the lock, and turned it with care. The latch gave way with a soft click. He opened the box slowly. Inside, a black and white photo of a unit lined up in front of a mountain ridge. Men in fatigues, faces serious, dirt on their cheeks. Dan and Kyle stood side by side at the center. Beside the photo, wrapped in cloth, was a purple heart. Untouched. Unworn. And beneath both items, a notarized transfer of vehicle ownership, legally signed and dated 6 months earlier. Lawson took a slow breath through his nose. Where was this? Dan answered without looking up. Under the glove box. Beneath the manual. Kyle hid it there himself. An officer was dispatched to the SUV to check. Within minutes, he returned with the same envelope, its seal intact. He handed it to Lawson, who opened it and silently confirmed. It's all here. Signature, witness, even a statement from his doctor. Bennett placed a hand on the wooden box, then turned toward Lawson. I believe this concludes the misunderstanding. Dan stood still beside him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence no longer felt suspicious. It felt earned. The parking lot of the Millfield Police Department had started to gather a quiet crowd. Word spreads fast in a small town, especially when it involves flashing lights and a judge showing up in the middle of the day. A local reporter had caught wind of the unusual scene and was already on site, camera crew trailing behind her. The SUV sat like an anchor in the middle of it all, still caked in dried mud, but now surrounded by something heavier than suspicion, attention. Dan stood beside the vehicle, his posture still straight, hands tucked loosely in his jacket pockets. His silence hadn't changed, but something in the way people looked at him had. It wasn't the glare of doubt anymore. It was the hesitation of uncertainty. The beginning of doubt in their own assumptions. Detective Lawson approached slowly, shoulders slightly hunched, trying to find a softer version of himself. He stopped a few feet away. Sergeant McAllister, he said, his voice quiet, almost careful. I'd like to, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for how this was handled. Dan didn't turn to face him. Bennett, standing nearby, responded instead. This man doesn't need your apology, detective. The silence that followed was sharp but not cruel. He didn't ask to be judged. He didn't ask to be believed. He just lived. Quietly. With honor. Lawson lowered his head, nodding once, and stepped back. The local reporter raised her microphone, stepping into the open space just off camera. Judge Bennett, she called, can you comment on the situation? What exactly happened here today? Bennett didn't flinch. He stepped forward, past the other officers, past the bystanders now gathering with phones raised and heads tilted. He looked directly into the camera. You didn't find a thief today, he said evenly. You arrested a hero. That's all I have to say. He turned away just as quickly as he'd stepped forward, leaving the rest to hang in the air. The cameramen kept rolling, but the story had already written itself. A few quiet claps came from the crowd. Then a few more. Not loud. Not celebratory. Just respectful. Someone had seen enough to understand that silence was the truest measure of the moment. A child pointed at the SUV and whispered something to his mother. Dan looked up then, his eyes meeting the young boy's for a brief second. Then he lowered his gaze again. Judge Bennett moved closer, speaking low enough that only Dan could hear him. I wasn't sure it was really you until I saw the box. But I remember your name. My son told me once, if anything ever happened to him out there, it was you he'd trust to bring him home. Dan didn't speak. But his jaw clenched, just once. You brought a lot of men home, Bennett continued. Including mine. Dan nodded, just slightly. It was enough. A few volunteers from the local VFW post had arrived with towels and buckets. Without being asked, they began wiping the mud from the SUV, as if returning something sacred to its rightful dignity. They didn't ask questions. They didn't say much. They just cleaned. The news van began packing up. A few of the curious drifted away, their thirst for drama quietly quenched by something gentler, reverence. Dan stood still through it all. Not because he was stuck, but because he understood the power of standing still in a world that rushed to speak. A young woman stepped forward, holding a gift card and a plastic bag of travel snacks. She didn't say anything. Just held them out. Dan looked at her, then at the items, and took them gently. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time the crowd heard his voice. Soft. Dry. But real. She nodded, her eyes a little glassy, and stepped back. As the sun dipped slightly lower behind the clouds, Dan turned to the judge one last time. "Will that be all?" Bennett gave him a long look, then smiled, not the smile of approval, but one of recognition. "Yes," he said. "That'll be all." And with that, Dan turned back toward the SUV, letting the rest of the world settle behind him. For now, he had a road ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he wouldn't be carrying someone else's doubt with him. The wind had softened by late afternoon, carrying with it the distant smell of pine and old pavement warmed by the sun. The crowd had mostly dispersed. The reporters had packed up their gear. The officers returned to their routines, some quieter than before. And yet, something remained suspended in the air, like a conversation not quite finished. Dan stood near the SUV, the wooden box still cradled in his hands. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. He felt the shift. The weight that had pressed on him since morning was still there, but it had changed shape. It no longer came from others. Now, it was something remembered. Something personal. Judge Harold Bennett stood a few feet away, watching him. "You never opened the letter addressed to you," Dan said, his voice quiet but firm. Bennett nodded. "I will. Later." Dan didn't press him. Bennett stepped closer. His tone softened. "My son mentioned your name once. Back when he came home." Dan's eyes flicked toward him. There was no visible reaction, but he was listening. He said there was one man he trusted more than the chain of command. One man who didn't panic when the shooting started. Said if things went bad, he hoped you'd be the one nearby. Dan looked away, toward the horizon. "I wasn't always nearby," he said. Bennett took that in without speaking. After a long pause, he said, "You pulled him from a downed helicopter. He was 19. We'd barely gotten used to him shaving." Dan didn't answer, but his grip on the box tightened. "I never thanked you," Bennett continued. "Not properly." "You don't have to," Dan said. "I know," the judge replied. "That's why it matters." A bird cried in the distance. Tires crunched over gravel somewhere behind the building, unnoticed. They stood in silence. Then Bennett added, "You've been carrying this alone for a long time." Dan gave a single nod. "Too long." Bennett reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He held it out. "My son kept this. Said it wasn't his to keep." Dan looked down at the bundle. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a silver star inside a velvet case. The ribbon was still pristine. "I turned this down," Dan said. "I know," Bennett replied. "But he kept it anyway. Said someone needed to make sure it got to you." Dan stared at the metal. Then closed the case and held it against his chest. "Do you want to stay in town for the night?" Bennett offered. "I can arrange something quiet. No questions." Dan shook his head. "Too many eyes. I'll be gone before sunup." Bennett didn't argue. He placed a hand gently on Dan's shoulder. "If you ever change your mind." Dan met his gaze for a moment. Then gave the faintest smile, a crack in the armor. "I won't," he said. "But I appreciate it." The judge stepped back. Dan returned to the SUV, opened the back, and placed the box and metal inside with care. He stood there a while longer, just looking out at nothing in particular. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about where he'd sleep or how much gas was left in the tank. He was thinking about a 19-year-old kid in a chopper. About a promise that somehow, after all this time, had been kept. Not just by him. But by someone else too. The early light had just begun to stretch across the lot when Dan closed the back hatch of the SUV. The vehicle was clean now. The windows clear, the body free of mud. Someone had taken the time, during the night or early morning, to wash away what the storm had left behind. A quiet thank you, the kind Dan understood best. He stood for a moment, watching his breath drift in the cold air. Then he walked slowly around the side of the SUV, checking the tires, brushing dust from the handle. Old habits. Rituals learned from decades of preparing for movement. Of never staying too long in one place. He didn't expect anyone else to be there. But as he reached the driver's side door, a voice called gently from across the lot. "Mr. McAllister." He turned. It was the young woman from the day before. She stood near the edge of the pavement, gloved hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup, her posture respectful, hesitant. "I wanted to say goodbye," she said. "And thank you." Dan gave her a slight nod. "You remind me of someone," she added, stepping a little closer. "My grandfather. He didn't talk much either. But he looked at people the same way you do. Like he already knew if they were good or not." Dan's expression didn't change, but he said softly, "What was his name?" "Frank Dawson. He served in Vietnam." Never talked about it, but he always carried himself like something still mattered. Dan nodded again. "Sounds like he did." She smiled, then extended her hand to offer the coffee. "It's not much, but figured you might need it for the road." He took it gently. "Thank you," he said. They stood there for a beat. Nothing more needed saying. She stepped back as Dan opened the door. Before climbing in, he looked up and across the lot. Judge Harold Bennett was there, leaning quietly against his car. Their eyes met. Dan raised his hand in a slow, steady salute. The judge returned it, just as precise. And then Dan McAllister slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and prepared to leave Millfield behind. The road out of Millfield curved gently past old fields and rows of empty storefronts just starting to catch the first light of morning. Dan kept his eyes ahead, hands steady on the wheel. The coffee sat in the holder beside him, untouched but warm. The SUV moved without sound, except for the low hum of the tires against the pavement, steady, familiar, honest. There were no signs telling him where to go. No voice giving instructions. Just a sky opening ahead, washed in soft orange and pale gold, and the open road stretching toward places he hadn't seen yet. He didn't know what town would come next. That didn't matter. He hadn't made this trip for the destination. In the rearview mirror, Millfield grew smaller. A town like 1,000 others. But something had shifted there. Not in the town itself, but in the space between people. Between judgment and understanding. Between noise and silence. Dan glanced once more at the small wooden box on the passenger seat. Still closed. Still holding the things that mattered, things that didn't need explaining anymore. At a quiet bend in the road, a lone figure stood beside a parked car, arms folded. Judge Harold Bennett. Dan eased the vehicle to a stop for a brief moment. They locked eyes across the distance. Neither man spoke. But the message was clear. Respect. Recognition. Closure. Dan gave a small nod. The judge responded the same. And then Dan pulled forward again, gently pressing into the gas. The SUV picked up speed as the town disappeared fully behind him. No ceremony. No headlines. Just a quiet man, still honoring a promise. And as the trees gave way to open sky, and the sun warmed the windshield in soft light, one thought passed through his mind, not loud, not dramatic. Just truth. Not all medals are pinned to uniforms. Some are carried. Some are remembered by the people who never stopped walking. In a world quick to judge and even quicker to move on, Daniel McAllister's story reminds us of something deeply human. Dignity doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it sleeps in the back of an old SUV. Sometimes it waits quietly behind tired eyes and weathered hands. This wasn't just a story about a man falsely accused. It was about a man who chose silence over anger and honor over vindication. Through small moments, a folded letter, a returned salute, a washed windshield, we're reminded that the greatest heroes often ask for nothing in return. How many people have we passed by, assuming we knew their story? Maybe we all need to pause, to look twice, and to remember that not all battles are visible, and not all warriors wear uniforms. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think, feel, or remember someone, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in quiet strength, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to be carried forward.